I'm Graham Jackson. I'm the forensic scientist of this trio. I hope to be able to revisit the Jill Dando Barry George case, which Paul mentioned, because I think it's a nice example of how we can apply this theory in practice. And I'll pick up a few things that Paul was saying before. I agree fully with Paul. It's all about communication, and particularly how experts communicate their opinions and how they are then used by the courts after. A little bit of the structure of my talk. I want to just again briefly recap the background to our work and focus then on something about how we attempt to classify expert opinions. And I'll introduce this notion of a hierarchy of issues that the scientist or expert can use to kind of position themselves within that case. And then I'll finally briefly talk about a possible checklist that can be used. Okay, a little bit about the background from the forensic scientist point of view. Well, I suppose you all know, we've got fantastic techniques available now which have high discrimination. And as forensic scientists, we tend to be a bit geeky, and we like our instruments and techniques that, all singing, all dancing. And you've seen them on CSI and stuff like this. However, it's fair to say forensic science is relatively young science, and there's been not a lot of impact of interpretational models over the years. The last 20 years or so has seen a bit of a change in that, but when I was brought up in the 60s and 70s in forensic science, it was very much about the technique. And if we gave opinions like our mentors gave opinions. There was no real theory about how we arrive at those opinions. And very much the theme, and it still is today in some areas, is very much about the opacity of expert opinions. And Paul's mentioned this thing, trust me, I'm a doctor. Trust me, I'm a forensic podiatrist. Trust me, I'm whatever. Trust my opinion. And so there's not a lot of transparency goes on quite often. And we also know that when forensic science or expert opinion is involved, where things go wrong and where there are miscarriages of justice, it's all about misinterpretation, either by the expert themselves or by how that's received then by the fact finder. And there are quite significant, not a huge number, but when they happen, they are significant cases and miscarriages of justice occur. We have this feeling as well of a black box syndrome that the police, who are the primary commissioners of forensic science, it has been the situation where they see forensic science maybe as a black box. You shove evidence items in one end, and out the other end, many weeks later, pops the result and opinion. And they don't really want to know what goes on inside that black box, and quite rightly so in many ways. And there's another background issue as well, that since the early 1990s, forensic science in England and Wales started to move down the line of privatisation, which was finished a few years ago with the full privatisation of forensic science provision. And some of you may know the previously public body, the Forensic Science Service, eventually has gone out of business because it appeared to their owners not to be profitable. And now all forensic science in England and Wales is provided by private providers or by police in-house providers. And all that commercialisation resulted in, obviously, a drive for value for money, which we all want to see as taxpayers, and also effective use of resources. But I think what I'm trying to talk about, and Paul's mentioned it as one of his highlights, is how we communicate our expert opinions. And it's the word which is useful is effective communication. When we look at how we communicate our opinions, you'll see, if you've maybe read reports or been on the jury, as this gentleman here is, you'll see there's a very wide range of expressions are used to express our opinions. And you kind of think, well, why is that? Why don't we have a standard form which would be a common language between us, which would be good for starters as scientists, but then hopefully that would be understandable and meaningful to the people who are using our information, the fact finders. And a lot of these opinions, these styles of opinions, were based on personal and institutional preferences. I know when I started, I just followed what my mentors, my trainers were doing, and I followed what they said. So there was no real challenge to say, well, why are we saying it like this? What's the basis for this? And when we look at the Court of Appeal rulings in certainly England and Wales jurisdiction, there's very little guidance apart from these Court of Appeal rulings, and maybe Paul will disagree with this, but I particularly find the Court of Appeal rulings, and I've read most of them, of the high-profile cases of the last 20 years, I find it quite confusing in terms of helping me to present my evidence in a better way for the court. I find some contradictory views in the Court of Appeal rulings, which for me are not helpful, for me as a scientist. Now, there are some standards published by various bodies, one of which is the Association of Forensic Science Providers. That's the group of leading providers. They have come up with some kind of standards for expert opinions, which is also being now reflected in the European standard, both of which are based on a likely ratio approach to expert opinion. The Forensic Science Regulator for England and Wales, it will be a she come November, they have produced some kind of guidance. It's a code of practice, and there are some standards. And it doesn't really, I don't think it really tells me how I should form my opinion, apart from it should be scientific, should be justifiable, should be robust, words like that. Okay, so let's just look at some of this wide range of opinions that are used. I'll take a case which some of you may be familiar with, particularly if you're from Scotland, where I currently live and work. This is a case of a sad case of two young women who were murdered way back in 1977. This man, Angus Sinclair, he was charged with their killing a few years ago, and he was, I think the case was actually thrown out eventually. A lot of it was based on circumstantial evidence and some DNA evidence, but the judge threw the case out eventually. I think I'm right in saying that, Paul. But in any case, he is now being retried under this change of law in Scotland, the double jeopardy laws, which I think also came in earlier in England and Wales, I think. So he is about to appear at the retrial beginning, I think it's October this year. I just want to go to the original trial, which was reported in the press. And I'm using quotes from the original trial, which hopefully are a fair reflection of what was said by the scientists and others at this trial. There were quite a few scientists involved because there was quite a range of scientific evidence. I'll just quickly put these up. I'm sorry, I should say this isn't from the press reporting. This is from the statement by the Lord Advocate in the light of that failed trial. So I'm hoping that it was a she at the time, she has quoted the trial verbatim. And there's just some of how the expert evidence was reported, just four different areas maybe. I think 3 of the areas are to do with medical evidence, the 4th one is to do with fibres, I think. And you see, I'll just highlight a few phrases. Consistent with. So there's someone got some evidence, and the medical expert saying, well, that's consistent with strangulation. Another expert says, well, this evidence could indicate that something happened. Then another one said, considered likely to have been caused by. Okay. And then we get this rather contorted, what may appear to be contorted statements. So am I in the way of this? Okay. Something about strong scientific evidence of having been in contact. So we've got strong scientific evidence, could have indicate consistent with. And here's a few more. Okay, I'll just highlight this. There's someone's reporting a partial match. And what does that mean? What's the probative value of that? How does the jury use it? There's something, again, we're consistent with. And finally, we get this huge one, which is something about the probability of the semen originating from someone other than the defendant was 1 in a billion. So, for me, I think it's quite confusing. If I were a layperson and I was on the jury in this, what do I make of all these different forms of opinions? It's not for me to tell the jury what to do with them. But let me go on to the next bit I want to talk about, the case assessment and interpretation model. This is a conceptual framework that we developed when I was in the Forensic Science Service. I and others developed this way of approaching a case because we felt it was to try to get us into a more uniform way of appraising our evidence. But also, before we do anything, it helped us devise efficient, effective case strategies before we actually commit any resources. And that was our primary aim when we developed this model with our colleagues. Our primary aim was to meet the needs of our customers. As that nasty word customers came in the early 90s. But it's a useful concept that we're not there to satisfy ourselves, we're there to provide a service to people who use our information. We wrote about this first in 1998. I'm hoping that this presentation will be available afterwards through the conference website somehow. Okay. Get back to that. Okay. I just do want to get in the way of these people here. Tell me if I'm in the way. Okay. Very much this model is based on a probabilistic approach using a Bayesian paradigm, but focusing very much on the likelihood ratio aspect of a Bayesian paradigm to help evaluate the force of the evidence. And it's been extensively applied now across practically all mainstream forensic science disciplines and even into the more fringe areas as well. And through this application of the last 15 or more years, we've developed insights of our forensic science opinions. And I just want to sort of focus on a couple of aspects of those now. There's two key aspects that come out of this model, and the first one is about classifying the opinions that we do give. And we thought it's useful to start that way. You know, it'd be useful to start with a blank sheet and build it from bottom up. But we are where we are, or we were where we were. People were giving opinions in different forms. So we wanted to classify those opinions to try to understand them and challenge them. But also this other concept came up about a hierarchy of issues, about how can we best help position ourselves within a case. So if we look first of all about the classification of opinions, I just want to run through a case which the images have been provided by a colleague of mine, Professor Sue Black at Dundee. She's an anatomist. She works a lot with particularly paedophile cases where there are images provided of a paedophile event, and they may then have a suspect, the police may then have a suspect, and they want to compare images of his Tenilio's hands with the hands in the crime footage, the person actually committing the offence. They're not nasty images, it's just the images of the hand basically. And that was an image of an actual event, a paedophile event. This was an offender, the offender's hand on the child's body. So there's the offender image in close-up, and here's the suspect image. This was of a person that the police suspected had committed that crime. And we're going to compare these two, and Sue and her team compare all the fine details that they can see within those images. So there'll be things like the size and shape of the nail, the crease marks around the knuckle, maybe some blemishes like freckles and other things like that. And once she's compared them with her team, and maybe she's seen no differences which would say that's an exclusion, she's seen sufficient similarities, she then has to convey, she doesn't have to, but it would help the court if she could convey the probative force of that similarity. Now, it may be that she sees something in those images and she says, I think that is the left hand of the defendant in that paedophile, that offence image. I think it's his hand. What's stopping me saying that? I'm the expert. I've looked at these images for many, many years. And we've called that a categorical for obvious reasons. It's a categorical statement about an uncertain event. It says this event has to be true. There's no probability at all involved. This is true. This is what's happened. Okay? Categorically. It's known colloquially as an identification. We prefer to use it, if you're an evidence scholar, we prefer to use the word an individualization. It's an individualization to one source. On the other hand, sorry, that's no pun, you may say the image of the hand is very likely to be that of the defendant, very likely to be that defendant. Now, whether you work in probabilities, whether you're a Bayesian or not, I still think ordinary people could classify that as a posterior probability in the sense that it comes after the evidence has been looked at and appraised. It's after the evidence is there. And it's a probability about that fact and issue. So whether you're probabilistic or whether you're statistical or Bayesian, I would hope that ordinary people, including lawyers, would see that as a posterior probability if we could explain it that way. We could say these things, and we've seen some of these examples before. Paul's used one or two examples like this from the RVT case, which I'll speak about later. We could say, well, yeah, there's no dissimilarities, there's a lot of similarities. The hand could be the hand of the defendant, or it's consistent with being that of the defendant. I'll leave it like that, and I think we'd all agree that a useful label for those is they're simply explanations. There's no probability attached to them. There's no probative force or weight attached. They're simply explanations. Now, I'm just going to quickly run through the benefits and limitations as I see them. I mean, you can add your own in here. This is not an exhaustive list. For me, a categorical opinion it's great. If you're a jury member or you're the fact finder, you've no more work to do. You've got the expert's view. Thank you very much. I'll now deal with it after that. It appears authoritative and convincing, particularly if you get very impressive witnesses in the box. And we've had maybe an example of that before. Very impressive medical witnesses, for example. And it would appear to the jury, well, he or she really knows their stuff there. That's very convincing, yeah. Okay. Well, there's a few limitations when you start to look at it. You kind of say, well, can a categorical answer be justified? Because in logical terms, you can justify it if it is a truly deductive answer, which in this case it certainly isn't, unless, say, there were only two possible or a defined group of perpetrators, and the other people you could all exclude. You could deduce that the one that matches must be the perpetrator. But there's not many circumstances in legal argument, I would suggest, that are truly deductive. Now there's this thing about, well, is it a personal conviction? Is it a personal conviction of the expert with many, many years standing, many, many cases? And I think a lot of the evidence that we see like this from experts, it is a personal conviction. Now, those of you who are statisticians will know there is a third way of arriving at a categorical conclusion, but we'll maybe not go down there just for the moment. I'll come back to personal conviction in a minute. But the big limitation, and this is coming back to the transparency thing that Paul mentions, is there may be something going on in the expert's mind, the background information, which has started to colour their prior view that the defendant was the man whose hand this is. And that may not be justified, it may be biased, it certainly won't be exposed or transparent. So there's a real risk that we as experts are influenced unknowingly, or maybe be generous, by this background information that is presented to us. And of course we've got this old idea of biases which is associated with that, particularly this confirmation bias thing. You only see what you want to see to confirm a proposition that's put to you. This was used in, again, this is a Scottish case. Shirley McKee was a police officer who was accused of perjury because she said she'd never been inside a murder scene, and the fingerprint guys and women said, we found Shirley McKee's finger mark, I think it was a finger mark, inside the premises. She was supposed to guard those premises and not to go inside this murder scene. And she said, I've never been inside, that's not my mark inside the doorway. And she was charged with perjury, but eventually, after a long process of getting a lot of experts looking at this mark, the vast majority of which said, no, that cannot be Shirley McKee's mark. But the people who originally gave the evidence still insisted it was Shirley McKee's mark. But nonetheless, she was acquitted of the perjury trial, of the perjury charge. And in light of that, there was a big inquiry in Scotland led by Sir Anthony Campbell. And he, after many months of evidence and deliberation, has said, finger mark evidence, it's very valuable, it can be very well controlled, lots of quality assurance and stuff like that, but in the end, it is a personal conviction of an expert, and the jury must see it like that. They must not see it as black and white categoric expert evidence. And that was a real landmark, I think, inquiry, certainly in Scotland, and maybe implications in England and Wales. Okay, let's look at this posterior probability thing. The benefits, well, it's still pretty good. It's maybe not giving us a categoric answer, but it's giving an answer, a sort of answer to a question that's important for the fact finder. It appears helpful, and again, it appears, the experts doing their job there. Well, if we're Bayesian, and I think maybe in terms of common sense, if we're not Bayesian, if we're giving that posterior probability, I think inevitably, there's got to be some kind of prior view of the probability of that event in the expert's mind, whether subconsciously or consciously, I don't know. Oh, blimey, right, that's gone quick. And inevitably, I think if that's not exposed, if it's not understood, there may be risks of bias in that as well. And we've got this subtle thing that the expert may be taking into account information or evidence that the fact finder will then take into account again, so there's a risk of double counting of evidence. And we said before, there may be some kind of transpositions going on there as well. Okay. All right, okay. There's some confusion here because this is not the same Adams as was mentioned before. This is a different Adams, but it was a similar series of cases. This was the opinion given in the trial of two guys, two separate trials, similar sort of opinion given, and they were convicted of rapes on the basis of DNA matching with semen from the scene, matching their blood DNA. And the appeal court said this, or the Court of Appeal said, the scientist should not be asked his, and it was him at that stage, on the likelihood that the defendant left a crime stain. And we can't give that view because there's other things imposing or having an effect on that prior view of the probability that the semen came from the defendant. And that information, the scientist may be aware of some of it, but he or she may not be aware of other circumstantial evidence that will be presented to the court, which would have an impact on that fact and issue. And so, this is for once, well, I shouldn't say for once, I could see in this Court of Appeal judgment that there was some logic and some robustness to the view that they gave. And if you think about it, then the same applies to all forms of expert evidence, all forms of opinion, I believe, that are in the forms of posterior probabilities. So if we're being logical about it, and it took a long time for lawyers to pick this up, I think, in England and Wales. Here you have a judgment from what do you call it? It's not a judgment, is it? A judgment in the Court of Appeal that said, in effect, the scientist can't give a posterior probability. That same principle could be applied to any form of expert evidence. Explanations, benefits, yeah, the useful first stage inferences that anybody, a trained monkey, could probably, given two sets of matching characteristics, say, that could have come from there, or whatever. And it's useful when we're in investigative mode, when we're helping the investigation prior to maybe a suspect is arrested or a defendant is charged. The limitations, again, if we just stay as could have, well, there's no assessment there of the evidential or probative force. We apply that to rare as well as to common materials. There may be better conjectures, better explanations that the scientist hasn't considered or maybe not offered. You could argue it from the prosecution or the defence side. Yeah, it could have come from it, couldn't it? But it may not have come from it, so the jury's left in limbo. And there's a big risk of misleading, as Paul's mentioned, I think, with one case. And he's also mentioned that there have been various reports from various jurisdictions that criticise the use of phrases such as could have come from or could have happened or consistent with. And there's just a few, if you're particularly interested in the legal side of things. The Kaufman Commission was in Canada, looked at the case that involved fibres evidence, was highly critical of the scientists saying the fibres could have come from this source. The case of Poaka was, I think, a facial image comparison. Again, the Court of Appeal was critical of the phrase could be the same or whatever. The Australian one was a DNA case where the scientist said, given a match, this DNA could have come from the defendant. And there's a huge report from the United States which looked at across the board of forensic science in the USA, and they were highly critical again of the phrases could have come from and consistent with 2 minutes. Right. Ooh. This is RVT that Paul's already mentioned, and you've seen that quote, I think, before. So, as a scientist, we were kind of saying, well, where does this leave us? We've got all this other stuff that says could have been made by, could have been left by. It's got a lot of limitations. But here now the Court of Appeal is saying this is a better phrase for the jury to understand. However, a case just a few months later in the same Court of Appeal where the scientist said, provided moderately strong support, the appeal court said, well, that seems fine to us. So we kind of, as scientists, all we want to do is help the courts, and we're kind of left a bit of confusion as to what to say. Of course, now, what we would propose, and it's most legal scholars and evidential scholars would suggest this as well, is to go down the likelihood ratio approach, and that's how we could report something like this evidence here, provided we have sufficient knowledge and understanding and robust, reliable, relevant data upon which to base some kind of appraisal in this way. The bottom form is simply translating the likelihood ratio, the log of the likelihood ratio, into some kind of verbal equivalent. There are a lot of problems with the verbal equivalent, so whilst I've used those over many years, I'm kind of going away from them a wee bit. And that does form the basis of this Association Forensic Science Providers standard. I don't want to labour this too much, because I'm sure most of us are kind of converts to a likelihood ratio, I suppose. There's a lot of benefits of applying this sort of approach from my point of view. The limitations, and Paul's mentioned them, is about comprehensibility, where this is what we should be presenting to the fact finders. And there's also a big issue from a scientific point of view about whether we have sufficient data and knowledge and understanding of the evidence type upon which to base reliable probabilities for our evidence. Conditional probabilities. Okay, can I just see where I am to see how much I've got to go? Sorry? Are you going to put the stop sign up? Okay. Can I just do a few more slides on the hierarchy, or are you going to pull the plug? Quickly, okay. Okay, so if we can classify opinions that scientists give now along these lines, and we put some hieroglyphics on there just to help us as scientists, the formulations of those actually then give us some clues as to about how we can check that those opinions have been formed in a reliable, logical, robust way. Hang on, I'll click through that. The hierarchy of issues is a very important aspect, a concept, and it really tries to help the scientists focus in on what they can help with. So we would look at a case and break it down into this generic structure and see where we're going to help the court. The higher up the hierarchy, the more value we give, we believe, to the court. That was the investigative mode. This is the evaluative mode, which is linked to the defendant. And what we've found is that our value increases as we go up the hierarchy, but in many cases involving DNA, we get beautiful big likelihood ratios where we're thinking about the subsource of the DNA. But when we progress up to whether or not he committed an act, like, whether he pulled the ligature tightly, or whether he had contact with this person in a certain way, or whether he wore the mask, then the evidential value potentially can have smaller numbers involved, smaller likelihood ratios. And therefore, there is a risk that the evidence is only presented at this lower level, but the court, the fact finder, immediately translates it through upwards towards the offence with the same value, which logically it may not have. Okay, I'll just quick through that. The checklist, I'll just show you a page from guide number 4. That was it's not available. I'll point over there. It's not available yet. There's 1 or 2 copies available through Colin's website, but the final version will be available soon. But at the end of that guide number 4, we put a checklist which is primarily aimed at lawyers to say, here's an opinion. How can I check it? How can I test it? How can I find out from the scientist how they have arrived at that opinion? So we're really hopeful that will be helpful to lawyers as well as scientists themselves to check their own opinions. So I think I'll leave it there, Colin, if that's all the time. I was going to go through the Barry George case, but I don't think we've got time for that.
Any questions? In jurisdictions where the verdict's determined by a judge rather than by a jury, does it make a difference? Does that affect how expert witnesses should present their evidence?
That's a good question. I think Paul maybe has a view on that, but I think it should, because I think we can probably, if we're experts, we can probably get at judges, if that's the right word. Well, we can probably communicate more generally with judges before they, go to the trial. We can get into their educational seminars and try to instill this sort of thinking with them. But when it comes to jury, how do you educate a jury? That's very much up to the lawyers and the judge. That's far more difficult. So I think the answer for me would be yes.
One more.
Hi. As a scientist, you like to think that truth is purely objective, and yet the scientists appearing in juries, in trials, don't appear to be objective at all, and the use of their adjectives shows their prejudices and things. And you'd wonder, for example, why did Roy Meadows sort of appear to destroy or change the evidence when he had nothing to gain from it at all?
I fully agree with you. I don't think every scientist is like that, but nonetheless they are prone consciously or subconsciously to cut some kind of bias, because you're commissioned by the prosecution generally, or you're commissioned by the defence. Now, the CI model is kind of trying to say, well, we only really need to know the evidence, the information that has a bearing on what we do in terms of our likelihood ratio, our formulation of propositions, and then our estimations of the probabilities of the evidence. So we're trying to avoid or make transparent the real risks of bias. But in the end, it's impossible to eliminate all forms of bias. And I think the only balance would comes through an adversarial system which has a defence which is equally armed as the prosecution, or some kind of strong regulation of forensic science. And at the moment, we've got strong regulation of the technical aspects of forensic science, but maybe not strong regulation of the opinions that we give.